our journey begins in the city of Jerusalem, when King Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and takes the nobles, the smiths, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem captive in roughly 592 to 597 BC. King Nebuchadnezzar took some of those captives to a place we currently call Spain and Portugal. And the following reference reads, the Spanish Jews maintained that they had been transmitted hither after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonian conqueror Nebuchadnezzar. Certain Jewish families, the Ibn Dawids and the Abarbanels, boasted descent from the royal house of Dawid and maintained that their ancestors had been settled since the time immemorial, partly in the district of Lucena and partly in the environs of Toledo and Seville. And it reads, the Lord also shall save the tents of Judah, affirms that at the desolation of the first temple, two families of the house of Dawid came and settled in Spain, one at Lucena and the other, the Abarbanels, at Seville. And from these came 1,000 offshoots. In this reference, we note the name Nasi is another name for YAH, Negro, and that the Hebrew word Nasi means prince. That's Strong's 5387. That's Strong's 5387. And the reference reads, the numerous Spanish Jewish family of Nasi also traced back its pedigree to King David and proved it by means of a genealogical table and seals. The family of Ibn Abelias was more modest and dated its immigration only from the destruction of the Second Temple. A family tradition runs to the effect that the Roman governor of Spain begged the conqueror of Jerusalem to send him some noble families from the capital of Judea, and that Titus complied with the request. So to recap, family, King Nebuchadnezzar took the inhabitants of Jerusalem to Spain and Portugal, and the Roman general Titus took the nobles to Spain and Portugal. And this is where Israel's dispersion around the world begins. In the year 1492, the children of Israel living in Spain and Portugal were expelled by way of an expulsion edict or decree. They were told to convert to Christianity or die. And it reads, Ferdinand and Isabel, by law, drove the Jews out of Spain. It's important to note that this decree impacted hundreds of thousands of Jews. Old references estimate the numbers upwards of 800,000 Brews. Newer references attempt to downplay the numbers. In any event, some Brews chose to become Christians and stayed in Spain. However, hundreds of thousands fled Spain. Some fled directly into Africa, while most fled into Portugal. And it reads, the Jews thus driven from Spain fled for the most part into Portugal. It is important to note that these Spanish and Portuguese Brews were black. Many references refer to these Jews as brown, black, very brown, and swarthy. Here are just a few references describing these Jews expelled in 1492. And it reads, thus they are fair in Britain and Germany, brown in France and in Turkey, swarthy in Portugal and Spain. And it reads, the English Jew is white, and the Armenian olive, the Arabian copper, the Portuguese swarthy. And the next reference reads, in France and Turkey, they are brown. In Spain and Portugal, their color is swarthy. And the next reference reads, 'Tis also a vulgar error that the Jews are all black, for this is only true of the Portuguese Jews, who, marrying always among one another, beget children like themselves, and subsequently the swarthiness or the blackness of their complexion is entailed upon their whole race. And just in case you're wondering what the word swarthy means, swarthy is of being a dark hue or dusty complexion, and this is a dictionary entry from an old dictionary. And you can see it also gives you an example of how to use the word swarthy. It says black as the swarthy African. So Africans were associated or called swarthy. And also the Brews were referred to as very black or very dark, especially in Spain and Portugal, as the following reference reads, and it reads, a tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard or a Jew about 50 years old. So one important note, Spanish and Portuguese Jews weren't just brown colored. They were dark brown, close to black. In fact, they were blacker than some Africans. And when they mixed with the Africans to produce mulattoes, some of the first generation descendants were darker than the Africans. As the following reference reads, and it reads, the Portuguese who planted themselves on the coast of Africa a few centuries ago have been succeeded by descendants blacker than many Africans. Now, this anonymous painting depicts life in Lisbon, Portugal in the 1500s. During this time, the Jews who embraced Christianity were forced to wear a red cross on their upper garment. Now, in this painting, you can see a gentleman on the bottom right riding a horse wearing a red cross of the converted Jews. And notice his skin color is close to black. Now, another description of these Spanish and Portuguese Brews involves their skull. When viewing the skulls of medieval Spanish and Portuguese Brews, they were identified as dolichocephalic, which is the skull of the present day Negro. The skulls of the Ashkenazi, on the other hand, are not dolichocephalic. Now, let's read a little bit about the skull of the Negro, and it reads, the Negroid type is primarily represented by the Negro of Africa between Sahara and the Cape District, including Madagascar. The skin varies from dark brown to brown black, with eyes of similar dark hue and hair usually black and always crisp or woolly. The skull is narrow, dolichocephalic. This next reference, it says dolichocephalic with dark skin and woolly hair. Now let's read from this reference here. You can see it on the screen. And it says, on the other hand, those of Africa and Syria have a purely dolichocephalic type of head. And now let's read the Journal of Science, which also confirms that the Spanish and Portuguese skulls are dolichocephalic as well, which is the same skull as the Negro. And it reads, the same variability occurs in other finds, but the skulls of most of the Sephardim or Spanish and Portuguese Jews are dolichocephalic. Alright, so hopefully you can see that not only the skull type of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews matched the skull of the Negroes, also the color matched the color of the Negroes. But alright, let's get back to Judah, who was taken into captivity from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and by General Titus of Rome, into Spain and Portugal. And from there, Spain expelled the Brews, who would not conform to Christianity. Now, some Brews fled into Africa and many fled into Portugal. And now we see Portugal send some of these Brews to West Africa, to the exact same places that the Transatlantic Slave Trade would start from less than 10 years later. Now let's read a little bit of that, and it reads, King John II in 1492 expelled all the Brews, or the Jews, to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, the black Portuguese, as they are called, so they were actually called black Portuguese, having skulls of Negroes and having the skin color of Negroes, they were called black Portuguese. And it says, as they are called, and the Jews of Luango, who are despised even by the very Negroes, are descendants. So it says they're descended from the very Negroes, is what that's saying. All right, let's keep reading. Now, I should note that as some Brews fled Spain into Portugal, there was a group of elites, or of nobles, that paid the king of Portugal to dwell there in safety for a period of time. In other words, the Brews remaining in Portugal and Spain after the expulsion edicts were forced Christian converts called New Christians. Now, this is when the church continues its open persecution of the children of Israel. However, this time they're persecuting the children of Israel who converted to Christianity. Now, to do this, Portugal and Spain started an institution called the Inquisition. The Inquisition was started with the sole purpose of persecuting the former Jews. In fact, the petition to the Pope to start the Inquisition mentions the Jews by name. Now, King John III is credited for starting the Inquisition in Portugal and using it to expel many of the Christian Jews to Africa and the Americas. This is where the children of Judah's journey to Savannah, Georgia begins. The Inquisition banished large numbers of Brews to Brazil. And it reads, in the year 1548, the Jews in Portugal were persecuted by some Catholics called inquisitors, and many of them were consequently banished to Brazil. And the next reference reads, in 1548, the Jews, many of whom had taken refuge in Portugal, were persecuted by the Inquisition and banished to Brazil. Now, it's from Brazil a large group of Spanish and Portuguese Jews would make their way to Savannah, Georgia, by way of Barbados. However, before discussing this group, let's first discuss another group of Spanish and Portuguese Jews who escaped up into England. Now, some Brews evaded the Inquisition and found refuge in England. Reads, meanwhile, the Jewish population of London had been continually increasing. Many causes contributed to the influx. Poverty, political troubles, religious persecutions, outbreaks of war, all acted as accessories to the immigration. The quarrels between the emperor and the Turks, the occupation and the recapture of Belgrade caused a temporary inflow towards England from that direction. The renewal of the Inquisition activities in Portugal served to increase the Sephardi, or the Spanish and Portuguese Jew, population of London. All right, so to recap, we're tracking two groups of Spanish and Portuguese Brews as they leave Spain and Portugal. One group gets captured by the Inquisition and gets placed in South Central America, mainly Brazil, while another flees from the Inquisition and begins to amass in England. It's during this time that England has colonies in what we would call today the United States. There were two states which offered the Brews a place of refuge by a charter of tolerance. In other words, there were two states that would allow the Brews to live there without religious persecution. It was the state of Georgia and the state of South Carolina. So in Georgia, there was one city these Spanish and Portuguese Brews converged on, the city of Savannah, Georgia. On the day, the 7th of July, 1733, that Oglethorpe had assembled the colonists on the site of the present city of Savannah, for the purpose of allotting to each settler his proportion of land, and of organizing a municipal government. A vessel directly from London came up the Savannah River whilst the colonists were partaking of a public dinner given at the close of the day's proceedings, and landed 40 Jewish immigrants. And the next reference reads, in July 1733, 40 Israelites arrived in Savannah. The gentlemen in England who were responsible for sending Jews to Georgia acted from purely charitable motives, with the avowed object of accomplishing the result which the London congregation desired to accomplish. Subsequent events too show that the settlers sent by them were entirely unexceptional. Under the rules of the trustees, nearly all being under 30 years of age, able-bodied and industrious. You see, family, there were so many Spanish and Portuguese brews arriving in Savannah that they made up 1/3 of the total population of Savannah, Georgia. Let me say that again. They made up 1/3 of the total population in Savannah, Georgia. There were so many of them, in fact, they had to rent a house for their assembly. Now, this meeting place was on Market Square in the city of Savannah, and it's important to note that this meeting place of the Spanish and Portuguese brews is on the same street as the First African Baptist Church, and it's roughly 3 to 4 blocks down the street. But let's go ahead and read this reference, and it reads, previous to their departure, articles used in the ceremonial service of the synagogue were presented to them by a friend in London. And one of their first acts after their arrival was to establish a synagogue, constituting as they did nearly 1/3 of the actual settlers. They had a large congregation, and accordingly, they rented a house on Market Square in Savannah for their synagogue, to which they gave the name Mikveh, or Assemblage of Israel, and where religious services were regularly held for some years. Now, when the Spanish and Portuguese brews lived in Savannah, they lived in an area on the west side of the city, the same neighborhood of the First African Baptist Church. Now, also keep in mind that some brews would leave a few years later during the English and Spanish War, only to return a few years later in large numbers. But this is when they were leaving during that time. It reads, this, however, is followed by another entry which shows that the majority of Jews had left Savannah, and they had left to go to Charleston, South Carolina. In July 1741, the journal recites, on the west side of Savannah lies the township lots of the Jews, all gone to the other colonies except for 3 or 4. All right. Now, this is another reference which shows the meeting place, or the location of the meeting place of the Spanish and Portuguese brews. And it reads, it says, at an unknown date, a house was rented on Market, now Ellis Square, and was altered for regular congregational services, but the small congregation faced internal problems. So this reference tells us that the location was on what was called Ellis Square. So some references will just say it's on Market, and some references will say it's on Ellis Square. And here's just another reference from the New Georgia Encyclopedia, just showing us where the meeting place or the assembly location was located. And like the other references, it says the congregation rented a house on Market Square, later Ellis Square. All right, so now we know where these Spanish and Portuguese brews were congregating. If you look at the map on the screen, this is a map of Savannah, Georgia, and what's circled on your screen is the location of the First African Baptist Church. And this is the area. The next area you see on your screen is the area of Market Square, right? Some references will say Market Square extends from Franklin Square all the way down to Ellis Square on your right-hand side. But here, just to be safe, I circled the location of Ellis Square as the location of the meeting place of the Spanish and Portuguese brews. But as you can see, these locations are extremely close to each other. They were in the same neighborhood. right? So basically the First African Baptist Church and the location of the Spanish and Portuguese Brews were in the same neighborhood. And also this highlighted area in green, remember, we read a reference which said that the Brews were required, or they lived in a township on the west side of Savannah. So what's highlighted on your screen is the west side of Savannah. So you can see that the First African Baptist Church is squarely within this area that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews lived in. Let's continue reading, family, and it reads, far from being newcomers, Jews are found in smaller or greater numbers in all of the 13 original colonies in the early days of colonial settlement. In some, like New York and Rhode Island, they appear in considerable numbers long before the close of the 17th century. And Yah willing, we'll get to this in another video. But it says in Georgia, they were among the earliest settlers. And it is therefore not unreasonable to expect to find Jewish settlers even in the early days of the Old Dominion. It is a curious fact that though the neighboring colonies of South Carolina and Georgia possessed a fair-sized Jewish community long before the Revolutionary War. So I want to stop here and just let you know that before the Revolutionary War, they had a fair size. And of course, we talked about during the Spanish War, there are many Brews that left Georgia, went up to South Carolina. But what you'll find in some of the subsequent references that even after the Revolutionary War, when they returned, that there was a large number of Brews that returned back to Savannah, Georgia. All right. So let's continue reading here. It says, the Jew, through the centuries of environment, is accustomed to the city rather than the country. So I just want to pause here just to let you know that the Brews were used to living in the city, that their place of dwelling of these Negroid people with dark skin, right, lived in the city. And if you look up the word ghetto in the Webster Dictionary, it says ghetto, a quarter or a part of the city in which the Jews were formerly required to live. So who lives in ghettos in the city today is the question. But let's go back to our reference, and it says the Jew, through centuries of environment, is accustomed to the city rather than the country. And this is possibly the reason why Charleston in South Carolina and even Savannah in the more recently settled colony of Georgia contained a considerable number of Jews at the outbreak of the War for Independence. All right. So just wanted to show you that there were a large number of Brews in Savannah. Just want to drive that point home, and also show you that they preferred to live in the city, right? All right. So to recap, at one time, 1/3 of the population of Savannah was composed of Brews. These Brews lived on the west side of the city, in the same neighborhood as the First African Baptist Church. Not only did they live in the same neighborhood, they were meeting at a meeting place that was on the same street of the church, 3 to 4 blocks away. Now, these Spanish and Portuguese Brews came from London as well as South America. All right. And in this reference, I just want to show you that some of these Brews, that they not only came from London, but they also came from South America. So let's read. It says, some of the Jewish settlers who came to Georgia within a year or two after the original settlement appear to have come from, or at any rate to have been, in South America. All right. So now we can see that South America, that the Inquisition Jews that were placed in South America were also coming to Savannah, Georgia. But let's see, I want to also use this reference to show you what the Jews did in the state of Georgia, because at this time, slavery in Georgia was outlawed, so it was not permitted. So they needed somebody to do the work. So let's read. It says, Mr. Oglethorpe had divided the colonists into parties. One cut forks, poles, lathes for building the bowers. Another set them up. A third fetched palmetto leaves. A fourth thatched, and a Jew workman, bred in Brazil, and had come from Savannah, taught them to do this nimbly in a neat manner. All right, so you can see that the Jew was a workman. He was bred, right? And there's another story behind that word bred in Brazil, but we'll leave that for another day. And the following reference reads, and it reads, immediately after the close of the revolution, many Israelites arrived in Savannah. All right, so I'm just going to pause here for a moment, family, just to point out that in previous references, we were reading references that show the Israelites before the Revolutionary War. And we also read that some of the Israelites left Georgia and went up to Charleston, South Carolina. But this reference focuses after the Revolutionary War, just to show you that they did indeed return, where it says immediately after the close of the revolution, many Israelites arrived in Savannah and made it their place of residence. All right. So family, we now know that the Brews were in Savannah, Georgia in large numbers. And in fact, that at one point they made up 1/3 of the population, and that they lived in and around the First African Baptist Church. And we can assume that they brought their language with them from their native land of Spain and Portugal. And so you may wonder, all right, so what does any of this have to do with the First African Baptist Church? After all, it has African in the name. It doesn't have anything to do with Israelites living in or around them. Or in other words, they're totally separate and isolated and distinct from these Spanish and Portuguese Brews. Well, let's see if that's correct. Let's read about the history of the church, and let's see if it has anything to do with the Israelites living in their neighborhood. And so let's start by taking a look at the pastor of the First African Baptist Church. I wonder what they called their spiritual leader, their pastor. So the pastor of this church, what was his title? Let's take a closer look at the former pastor of the First African Baptist Church, named Andrew C. Marshall. Does he have anything to do with Israel? All right, so you can see the reference on your screen where it says the history of the First African Baptist Church. So that was the name of the church, right? And Andrew C. Marshall was born a slave. He has traveled over a great part of the United States. He has by industry succeeded in purchasing himself and done many benevolent acts among his color, and has given to different institutions several $1,000s. The venerable father in Israel, Andrew C. Marshall. Wait, hang on a second. Let's read that again, family. I thought I heard Israel, and it says, he has by industry succeeded in purchasing himself and done many benevolent acts among his color, and has given to different institutions several $1,000s. The venerable father in Israel, Andrew C. Marshall, died in Richmond, Virginia, December 7th, 1856, while returning from the north to the people of his charge. Okay, family. In this reference of the history of the First African Baptist Church, we see the pastor was called the venerable father in Israel. You know what? Maybe that's a typo. So let's keep reading. Let's go down a little bit further in the book and see if we can find some other pastors that were called by this name. All right. So let's read a little bit. Let's go a little bit further. Now, this reference speaks about the very founder, the very first pastor of the church. So let's see what they called the very first pastor, the founder of the First African Baptist Church. And the reference reads, "It is very befitting, therefore, that we should welcome you. Our church was planted in blood. Reverend Andrew Bryan, its founding and first pastor, was whipped until his flesh was terribly torn. His blood ran freely and puddled by his lacerated body on the ground, for no other crime than that he preached Jesus to Africa's sable sons and daughters enslaved in this country. When he was commanded not to preach the gospel, he raised his dusky hand, stained in his own blood, drawn by his vile persecutors, and said with a trembling voice, with that manly heroism and Christian courage that the grace of God alone can fan into a burning eloquence, 'If you would stop me from preaching, cut off my head. This humble statement from our Father in Israel. I'm going to pause right here, family, because you see where it says from our Father in Israel, and using the word our, it implies both the pastor and the congregation considered themselves Israel. But you know what? Let's not stop there, family. Let's get some more additional information about the church. We see when they were living, they considered themselves Israel. But what about in death? When they died, did they also regard themselves as Israel? So let's take a look at a commemorative plaque in the church honoring the former pastor. Let's see if the plaque mentions Israel. And it reads, born in Marion, Alabama, July 27th, 1850, died Savannah, Georgia, April 24th, 1900, age 49 years, pastor, First African Baptist Church, 14 years and 6 months, a prince and a great man, fallen this day in Israel. 2 Samuel 3:38. Okay, family, let's review what we've learned so far. So we learned that many Spanish and Portuguese Brews came to Savannah, Georgia. We learned that the Brews made up at one point 1/3 of the population. We learned that they lived on the west side of Savannah in the same neighborhood as the First Baptist Church. We learned that they met on the same street as the church, about 3 to 4 blocks away. We learned that the founding pastor was referred to as Israel, as well as the congregation. We learned that another pastor in the church was referred to as the Venerable Father in Israel. We also learned that the church commemorated a deceased pastor by associating him with Israel. And as you can see, we haven't even reviewed the Hebrew on the pews yet. Family, at this point, hopefully you can see that this church, this Sunday church, this First African Baptist Church, didn't have any issues whatsoever referring to themselves as Israel. And it makes you wonder, what happened to the churches today? That unlike the early church, they seem to have a problem recognizing themselves as Yisrael. Perhaps the churches today need to go back to the beginning. Go back to where it all started in Savannah, Georgia, where the pastor was whipped for preaching the Messiah, then turned around and was referred to as Yisrael. There's a lesson to be had for the so-called African Americans today. However, I digress. But wait, there's more. Let's discuss the Hebrew written on the pews of the church that considers itself Israel, in the neighborhood of Israel. After all, the language of Israel is Hebrew.